this Congress to do something about the epidemic of mass shootings. We average more than a mass shooting a day right now. Kids are living in fear when they walk into school. People don't know where the next shooter is coming from. No place seems safe. And so what is Senate Republicans' answer to this paralyzing fear and anxiety that Americans have about mass shootings? Their answer today is to put a resolution before the floor of the Senate that would make legal a new class of semi-automatic rifles that has been banned for 100 years because they're too dangerous. So the answer to the mass shooting crisis in this country is more assault rifles, more dangerous weapons, taking a class of weapons that has been illegal for a century and putting them on the open market. That is outrageous, and it is completely removed from the conversation that families and kids are having all across this country. Instead of taking dangerous assault weapons off the streets, this resolution would put more of them into the commercial marketplace. And I want to talk for a few minutes today about how dangerous this resolution is, and to ask my Republican colleagues to vote with us, against this resolution so that we can protect our families and our kids from criminal acts and mass shootings. So, Mr. President, for almost a century, the law has treated certain types of firearms differently than others, namely those that Congress saw as more dangerous and more closely associated with violent crime. Short-barreled rifles are in that category. They are more transportable and concealable than long rifles. They have longer range, greater accuracy, and more firepower than pistols. Kind of the perfect recipe for criminals. That's in part why they are more highly regulated than your standard handgun or your standard hunting rifle, or even an AR or AK-style assault rifle. To own a short-barreled rifle in this country, you have to pay a $200 for a tax stamp, you have to undergo a background check, you have to register that firearm with the ATF. You can have one, but you have to go through that process. That system that courts have agreed is consistent with the Second Amendment allows for responsible, law-abiding citizens to acquire these dangerous weapons while keeping them out of the hands of criminals or people who want to commit crimes with them. Now, what's changed? Well, in recent decades, gun manufacturers have responded to the widespread popularity of AR-15 rifles by selling a variant that they call either a large format pistol or a heavy pistol. It's a shorter version of an assault rifle. Has a shorter barrel, it lacks a shoulder stock. But these guns theoretically can be fired one-handed, but very few people want to do that. They're too large and heavy to control effectively, and so they haven't been very popular in the marketplace. So the industry figured out a way to make them more popular. In 2012, the first stabilizing brace was created to help a disabled veteran shoot an AR platform pistol one-handed. And you can kind of see a crude version of it here. It was sort of a rubber sling that slipped over the buffer tube at the rear of the weapon and then cinched down on the shooter's forearm with Velcro straps. This original design solved a very specific problem for a disabled shooter. But the gun industry saw an opening, and it wasn't about to let that opportunity slip by. The large format pistol really took off in 2014, says one article in the NRA's own magazine, Shooting Illustrated. What began as this rubber orthotic device turned into something that looked very different, that looked exactly like a shoulder stock. Manufacturers started designing and marketing stabilizing braces designed for disabled individuals that would enable firing from the shoulder, firing short-barreled rifles, essentially, from the shoulder. And resources popped up all over the internet showing gun enthusiasts how to use these pistol braces designed for disabled shooters to turn their large format pistols, not very useful, into short-barreled, shoulder-fired weapons. Outdoor Life said, the AR pistol of yesteryear is not the same platform that shooters are enjoying today for one reason, the stabilizing brace. Now, to be clear, it has always been illegal for 100 years to modify a large format pistol by adding a stock or a brace for the purpose of firing it from the shoulder without going through that process I mentioned, getting the tax stamp, going through the background check. Whether knowingly or unknowingly, gun owners who modified their firearms in this way were creating short-barreled rifles. That's not allowed under the law. But manufacturers capitalized on widespread ignorance of the law to expand their stabilizing brace designed for disabled shooters and selling it as something intended to be fired from the shoulder by non-disabled individuals. And their advertising sometimes says that they weren't intending it to be fired that way, but over and over you see marketing suggesting something very different. Now, the gun lobby is going to tell you that this is a really, so here's what happened. The ATF stepped in to correct this, right? The ATF stepped in to eliminate this ambiguity and just make it clear that as you have not been able for 100 years to turn a short-barreled rifle into something you can fire from your, you can't take a pistol and use one of these braces to fire from your shoulder, that needs to be the rule and the regulation going forward. So the ATF steps in with a pretty simple rule that basically says if a brace-equipped pistol looks like a rifle, fires like a rifle, if the people who made it are trying to sell it as a rifle, then it's a rifle. There's no ban on these braces or on weapons equipped with them, even short-barreled rifles. You just have to abide by the law to acquire one, which means a tax stamp and a background check and registration. All we're doing, all the ATF is doing, is essentially reaffirming what has been the law for 100 years. If you want a short-barreled rifle or you want to convert a pistol into a short-barreled rifle, you just have to go through that process, get the tax stamp, go through the background check, register the gun. And at the same time, there's nothing in this rule to prevent a disabled veteran who wants to equip a pistol with a true stabilizing brace that is not designed to fire the weapon from the shoulder from doing exactly that, or to prevent a manufacturer from selling a stabilizing brace designed to satisfy those specific needs of the market. But this isn't what the gun industry has been selling. The gun industry hasn't been selling true stabilizing braces to disabled veterans. They've been selling an ability to convert a pistol into a short-barreled rifle. The opponents of this rule will tell you that it's an unconstitutional gun grab. They're not likely to tell you that it's just law enforcement doing their job and enforcing a law Congress made almost a century ago. The courts have upheld Congress's authority to regulate some firearms more stringently than others because they are especially dangerous or unusual, which is why there is no unrestricted right to own a machine gun or a sawed-off shotgun or a short-barreled rifle, no matter how it becomes a short-barreled rifle. When Congress passed the National Firearms Act, it chose to regulate these dangerous firearms by taxing them and requiring registration. Courts have agreed possession of an unregistered short-barreled rifle poses a danger to the community, Events have borne this out. Over the last 5 years, unregistered, arm brace-equipped guns have been used in high-profile mass shootings in Dayton, in Boulder, in Colorado Springs. Mass shooters like these unregistered arm brace-equipped guns. This is a good rule. It doesn't make any new law. It merely helps to enforce a law that's been on the books for almost a century. The ATF is just doing their jobs. To pass this resolution would put onto the conventional commercial marketplace a new class of dangerous, concealable assault weapons that for 100 years we have had consensus in this country need to be regulated in a more comprehensive way. The ATF is doing their job, and I'd urge my colleagues to oppose this resolution. Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut is recognized.
Mr. President, as you know, we are at an unprecedented moment in the history of the Senate. There are hundreds of brave, courageous leaders in our military who are being denied promotions, being denied the rank that they deserve because of the actions of Senator Tuberville and Senate Republicans. And Senator Tuberville was down on the floor just moments ago defending his actions. I think most Americans believe that his hold on all of these promotions is indefensible. But what probably won't get covered is an additional idea that he presented to the Senate in his remarks. Senator Tuberville said today that he thinks that our military leadership should be fired for failing to defeat the Taliban. That's pretty extraordinary. For those of us who have served in the Senate and in the House during the time that we've been in Afghanistan, we had the opportunity to see that mission on the ground. It was a difficult, hard mission. Some might say it was an impossible mission, badly under-resourced right from the beginning. But the idea that our soldiers or our military leadership, captains, lieutenant colonels, generals, should be fired because they couldn't perform a mission that was likely impossible, that, frankly, will have an even bigger chilling effect than Senator Tuberville's hold on military promotions. There's no doubt that there should be consequences for gross negligence on the job in any profession, including the military. But for any of us who saw the work being done in Afghanistan, our military, from the top down, they were doing the best they could under difficult circumstances. Refusing military promotions apparently isn't cruel enough. Now Republicans want military leaders fired when they can't complete impossible, under-resourced missions. This is a growing attack, a growing set of attacks on our military, and all in the service of a bunch of old men telling young women what health care they can get and what health care they can't get. Mr. President, I'd like the following remarks recorded as separate in the record.
Objection.
Mr. President, in May of 2019, Layla Hernandez had her quinceañera. She was in a bedazzled green gown. She looked absolutely magnificent. She was having a great sophomore year in high school. She was playing basketball, number 23. She had a lot of friends. One friend said that Layla was just one of these people full of joy and happiness. She knew how to make somebody's bad day turn into a good day. In September of that year, 2019, Layla went to a car dealership in the Midland, Odessa area of Texas. her 18-year-old brother Nathan was buying a truck, and this was a big deal for this family. And so I don't know if it was the whole family, but her mom was there, Nathan was there, she was there, her 9-year-old brother was there. And I believe as they were emerging from the dealership, they heard gunshots. Her mother took the younger brother, the 9-year-old, and they ducked underneath a car. Nathan, 18, all he could do is just wrap his hands around Layla. But the shooting was relentless. Nathan was hit in the arm, but Layla was hit closer to the neck. Layla's last words in the embrace of her brother were, "Help me, help me." She was one of 7 who died in the Midland-Odessa mass shooting. 32 people were shot. A lot of them, like Nathan, survived, many with injuries that will impact them for the rest of their life. But Layla Hernandez, just a few months from her quinceañera, died that day. The young man who shot her was ineligible to own a weapon. He had serious mental illness, serious enough that he was on the list of individuals who was prohibited from buying a weapon. He had tried to buy a weapon, but he had been denied when he tried to do it at a licensed gun dealer. He is one of millions of Americans who have been stopped from buying a gun because they're a felon or they are seriously mentally ill. But this young man was still able, rather easily, to get a weapon. Why is that? Well, it's because many of our weapons in this country are sold without background checks. What happened in this case? How did this young man with a serious history of mental illness get his hands on a powerful weapon that allowed him to kill Layla and 6 others? Well, the story runs through a man named Marcus Braziel. Marcus Braziel was a gun dealer. No doubt he was a gun dealer. He might not have had a bricks and mortar store, but Mr. Braziel was regularly selling guns. In a 3-year period of time, he bought 90 some odd guns, resold 70 of them. In the court papers that were part of his arrest and conviction, he admitted that he routinely bought firearm firing mechanisms, termed lower receivers, used milling equipment to build them into full-fledged guns, and then sold the completed weapons, each one for a profit of about $100, $200. He listed his firearms on armslist.com, and then he conducted the sales in a parking lot of a local sporting goods store, or sometimes out of his garage. He was a gun dealer, but he never performed background checks because he didn't get licensed. And when he advertised a weapon online, Seth Ator, prohibited from buying a gun at a bricks and mortar store, answered the ad, bought the weapon, and used it to kill Layla Hernandez and shoot 32 other people. This, unfortunately, is not the exception. This is, in America, the rule today. 22% of gun owners report that they obtained their weapon without a background check. And an analysis of gun sale ads from 2018 to 2020 revealed that the majority of those ads were being placed by people like Mr. Braziel, unlicensed sellers, not required to do background checks. And so what that means is that there are tens of thousands of guns, perhaps more, in this country every single year being not just sold without background checks, but being sold to individuals who are prohibited from buying those weapons. Because that's exactly where those people go. People like Seth Ator, the shooter in Midland, Odessa, they know that this black market exists. They know that there are people on armslist.com who will willingly sell them weapons without a background check. So when they get stopped from buying a gun at a gun store, they go and buy one online. That's the bad news. The good news, Mr. President, is that Republicans and Democrats in the Senate and the House recognized this problem. And as part of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act last year, we updated the definition of a gun dealer to make it crystal clear that people like Mr. Braziel need to get a license and they need to conduct background checks. What we did is to basically clarify that it doesn't need to be your full-time job. But so long as you are selling guns predominantly for a profit, you have to get licensed. You have to perform background checks. The Biden administration 2 weeks ago released a draft rule implementing that change that we voted for on a bipartisan basis in the Senate. And an analysis of the statutory change that we voted for and the rule that the Biden administration has proposed suggests that up to 328,000 additional dealers could be required to perform background checks. Now, even if those dealers are only conducting a handful of sales a year, and most of these are probably conducting dozens of sales a year, either at gun shows or online on sites like armslist.com, we're talking about millions of guns that right now are being sold outside the background check system that will now be sold inside the background check system. And that's a big deal because that shooter in Midland, he's not the exception. Like I said, unfortunately, he's the rule. And so by having so many more guns go through the background check system and really closing off the ways that felons, criminals, people with serious mental illness can buy guns, you are saving lives. Maybe Layla Hernandez, who would be alive today, she probably would be if this rule had been in place and Mr. Braziel had looked at that definition and come to the conclusion that he needed to get licensed. Admittedly, today, the definition is a little fuzzy. And without a rule making it clear what constitutes being a dealer and what does not, it's even harder for individuals out there to decide whether they need to be licensed or not. Now, Mr. Braziel's case was a pretty clear one. He obviously should have known that he was a gun dealer. That's why he got prosecuted and put in jail for the actions that led up to the murder of Layla Hernandez. But many other Americans may not know that they need to be licensed. Now, with this rule that the Biden administration has put forward, they will know, and they will get licensed. And so I hope that my colleagues will learn about this rule, that my Republican colleagues will understand how far it goes and how far it does not go. This does not mean that an individual who's just selling a gun to a family member is going to have to get licensed. That individual is not a dealer. It doesn't mean that someone who is just liquidating their collection of firearms has to be licensed. That person is not a gun dealer. And the rule makes it very clear who is a dealer based upon their desire to earn a profit, based upon whether they have the trappings of a business, based upon the places that they're selling weapons, where they're more likely to be strangers who they would need to have a background check to understand whether they're selling to a responsible individual. Those people have to be licensed, but there are lots of people who are selling 1 or 2 or 3 guns a year who likely don't have to be licensed under this rule. And so I hope my colleagues will do their own research, not just listen to the spin of advocacy groups, because I think if you do your own research, you'll find out that this is exactly what Americans want us to be doing. They want us to be making sure that when there are commercial transactions of weapons, there's a background check. And by the way, the background check takes 5 minutes. When it doesn't take 5 minutes, that generally is for a reason, that the individual likely has a more complicated mental health or criminal history that has to be unwound. So I'm really excited for the Biden administration's very appropriate steps to implement this provision of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And I will just finally note that it is the latest in a series of announcements making clear that the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act has had a substantial and important impact. Since the passage of the BSCA, almost 1,000 transactions of weapons to young buyers, those under 21, have been denied. We put in place an enhanced background check for 18, 19, and 20-year-olds when they're buying rifles, assault weapons. And that additional background check has already identified 1,000 people all across the country, young people, who would have gotten a weapon if not for the enhanced background check, but we found out that they actually did have a disqualifying record, a serious mental illness or a undiscovered criminal conviction, and they didn't get the weapon. That's really good news. Second, more than 100 defendants all across the country have been charged with new BSCA violations of gun trafficking. Gun trafficking wasn't a federal crime until we passed that law. Now it is, and over 100 cases have been brought against defendants for violations of trafficking firearms. Prosecutions against unlicensed dealers, even before the Biden administration's announcement of the rule, were up by 52%. And lastly, the administration has made 49 awards for red flag incentive grants, $231 million. And those funds have helped states implement existing red flag laws, but we stood here on the Senate floor and said, we bet you states are going to pass new red flag laws or stronger red flag laws, in part because of the money that they're getting from the federal government. That's exactly what happened just in the last year. Michigan, Colorado, Minnesota, to name 3 states, have passed new red flag laws or strengthened existing red flag laws and will now have additional resources to get the job done. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act doesn't do everything we need to do. It's not even close. We need to have universal background checks. We need to get these assault weapons off the streets. But we did show that Republicans and Democrats can step up and make meaningful changes in the law to protect people from gun violence. The Biden administration's rule implementing the change in the definition of a gun dealer is going to mean that millions of gun sales that 2 years ago were made without a background check are now done with a background check. That means a lot fewer dangerous people get weapons in this country. That's good news for everybody. I yield the floor.
Leah, listen, I meant what I said this morning. There is no anti-gun violence movement that wins without young people. This is your movement. You are seeing it in real life. Let me just take one quick point of personal privilege. I get to engage in this fight every single day alongside the best delegation in the country. You saw Senator Blumenthal up here earlier, but I am also joined here today by 3 members of the House delegation, Representative Rosa DeLore, Representative Johanna Hayes, and Representative John Larson. Give them a big round of applause. They are all fighters. So I am the only thing standing between you and the President of the United States. So I am going to get right to the point. And the point is this: the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act that we are celebrating and talking about today would not have happened without Joe Biden. When we say it's been 30 years since we beat the NRA, What we really mean is that it's been 30 years since Joe Biden beat the NRA, right? It was Senator Joe Biden and a handful of others who took on the NRA and the gun lobby in the 1980s and the 1990s and secured passage of those landmark pieces of legislation, the Brady background checks bill and the assault weapons bill. Joe Biden was fighting and beating the gun lobby before anybody else was. He knows how to do it. And last summer, after Uvalde, Joe Biden stepped up again. In the days after the shooting, we had begun early bipartisan meetings, but most of the pundits, they just wrote us off, right? They'd seen it before. A mass shooting happens, followed by some chatter of action, and then nothing. Republicans and Democrats just retreating to their corners. The week after Uvalde was a recess week for Congress, so we were all going back to our states and to our districts. We were leaving town. Even more reason to think that this momentum, whatever we had, was going to vanish. But then I got a call from the White House. They told me that the president was considering going on television, using one of his few precious primetime addresses to challenge Congress and the country to make this time different. He called me, and we talked about how some people were saying that this time wasn't going to be different, that some people were saying that a speech wasn't going to make any difference. But he told me, I care about this issue so deeply in my bones, the safety of our kids, that I'm willing to take any chance, no matter how remote, to get something done. If I give this speech, is it going to help? He asked. I told him he would. And you remember this address, this emotional, heartfelt plea to the nation at a moment when we could have lost all of that momentum. And along with his daily support of our month-long talks, Joe Biden is the biggest part of the story as to why the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act became law. Now, President Biden knows the feeling of loss, and maybe that's why he wears his feelings about this issue on his shirt sleeve. Maybe that's why he feels this connection to many people in this room who have lost loved ones to this epidemic. Maybe that's why he's joined us here today, to help us talk about the progress we've made and the progress that we are going to make. But I will end by saying what I have said now 2 different times on this stage over the course of today. I believe that the next decade is our movement's decade, a decade to consistently make changes to our laws to make our communities and our kids safer from gun violence. And that opportunity exists because we have a president who eats, sleeps, and breathes the fight to end this epidemic. Our president, President Joe Biden.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I wish this were not true, and it's true in the United States and nowhere else. But on average, 70 women across this country are killed each month by an intimate partner, a husband or a boyfriend, mostly. And most all of those murders are at the hands of a perpetrator with a firearm. In the United States, women are 21 times more likely to be killed by a gun than women living in any other high-income nation. I get it that the numbers that we throw around when talking about the gun violence epidemic sometimes can get a little numbing and overwhelming, but that's a really damning, unconscionable statistic. If you live in America as a woman, the most affluent, most powerful country in the world, you are not twice as likely to die as women in other countries at the hands of a firearm. You're not 5 times more likely. You're not 10 times more likely. You are 21 times more likely, living in the United States of America, to die from a gunshot wound as a woman than women living in any other high-income country. I'm not talking about comparing the United States to some war-ravaged developing nation in the middle of civil conflict. I'm talking about comparing the United States to other peer nations. That's unacceptable. Now, we made progress last year. We made progress last year because Republicans and Democrats came together and said, you shouldn't be able to have a gun anywhere in this country if you have a judicial history, if you have a conviction related to domestic violence. And so we changed the law. We eliminated something called the boyfriend loophole, so that whether you are a spouse or an intimate partner or a dating partner, you now can't get your hands on a weapon, you can't buy one, you can't have a weapon if you have been convicted of a domestic violence charge. That was good news, and the reason that we did that, despite the fact that the gun lobby opposed it, is because the American public have just made up their mind on this question. Now, in general, on most questions about keeping dangerous weapons away from dangerous people, 80–90% of Americans have already decided that they just would rather we err on the side of caution. Specifically, on this question of prohibiting abusers, domestic abusers, from owning guns, 83% of Americans support that. It's really hard to get 83% of Americans to support anything in this country. This is, maybe the most popular public policy intervention in America today, stopping domestic abusers from getting firearms. And so the gun lobby and the gun industry, which wants to sell weapons to everybody, regardless of their criminal status, cannot win that fight here in the United States Senate. They lost that fight last year because the American public have made up their mind. You are likely not getting reelected to Congress from a swing state or a swing district if you are voting against measures to take guns away from domestic abusers. But here's the problem with the state of American politics today. There are now 2 legislative lawmaking bodies. One of them is the United States Congress. The other is across the street at the Supreme Court. And so over and over again, when an industry or a right-wing interest group can't move the laws of Congress in their favor because the American public is so wildly against their priority, they just shift the venue of the fight across the street to the Supreme Court. And that is what's happening right now as we speak on this question of keeping guns away from domestic abusers. Today, the Supreme Court is hearing the case of United States versus Rahimi. And let me tell you a little bit about Zackey Rahimi. He was a drug dealer with a history of armed violence towards intimate partners and a history of firing guns in public places. In the winter of 2019, Rahimi had an argument with his girlfriend in a parking lot. She tried to walk away from that argument knowing about his penchant for violence. But he grabbed her wrist, he knocked her to the ground. He then dragged her back to the car, picking her up and throwing her into the vehicle, causing her to hit her head on the side of the vehicle. Upon realizing that a person witnessed the assault, Rahimi retrieved a gun and fired a shot into the air, during which time his girlfriend escaped. It won't surprise you that his girlfriend went and got a restraining order against him. He was vicious and violent, firing guns in public into the air as a means to threaten her. She went and got a restraining order. That restraining order required Rahimi to be noticed to the criminal background check system so that he couldn't own or buy guns. 83% of Americans think that's a great idea. Somebody with that kind of dangerous history, with an active restraining order against them, should not be able to buy a gun or possess guns. That was the law in Texas at the time. It worked for this woman who was being badly abused, and her life was unquestionably under threat. Rahimi thinks that he should have the guns, thinks that notwithstanding his long criminal history, the restraining order, that the Constitution requires him a domestic abuser to have weapons. And so he has brought a case that has reached the Supreme Court asking to invalidate all laws that keep weapons away from domestic abusers who are subject of restraining orders. If this case is decided in his favor, it is not just an outrage, it is not just dangerous, it is a frontal assault on democracy. Because what it would say is that the Supreme Court, not the United States Congress, not the elected branch of government, is going to micromanage the decisions as to who can have a gun and who can't have a gun. They will decide who's dangerous and who's not dangerous. And that should make you really nervous if the outcome of this case is to decide that Zackey Rahimi is a responsible individual capable of owning and possessing more weapons. Later in that year, Rahimi threatened another woman with a gun, which resulted that time in a charge of aggravated assault. Rahimi then participated in 5 separate shootings. 5 separate shootings, all of which were in public places. Rahimi was arrested, convicted of possessing a firearm. He was ultimately sentenced for these crimes for a long time in jail. So, restraining orders are designed to look at someone, assess their penchant for violence, and then take guns away from them to protect a spouse or a woman or a girlfriend. Rahimi was violent. He was wildly violent after the restraining order. This is exactly who the law in Texas is designed to protect us from. And yet, we are perhaps weeks away from the Supreme Court invalidating that law, invalidating Connecticut's law, invalidating Georgia's laws, so that domestic abusers with histories of vicious assault can get their hands back on weapons. But this should come as no surprise to Americans, because we have won this fight. This fight to start moving the laws of this country towards common sense. We want people to have a right to own firearms. I believe in the Second Amendment. I believe the Second Amendment protects the right of private gun ownership. I do. But I think that there's a class of individuals, a pretty small class of individuals, who have demonstrated so clearly that they are so dangerous and so irresponsible with firearms that they should not have them. It is a small class of individuals. But Zackey Rahimi is clearly in that class. And the idea that we are weeks away from somebody like him being able to get guns again should shake this country to its foundation. Maybe the Supreme Court listens to America, maybe they don't. But this country needs to understand the gravity of the decision that is being made and the wholesale shift that will occur in legislating on the question of gun safety. If Rahimi wins this case, we are no longer in charge. The Supreme Court will now, on a case-by-case basis, decide who can have a gun and who can't. Frankly, that's bad for progressives and supporters of gun violence. That's bad for conservatives as well. Because once the Supreme Court gets in the business of that kind of micromanaging, we are all out of jobs. We'll just show up to work, punch our clock, but have really nothing to do, because they ultimately will pull the strings. They will substitute themselves as the new governing, policy-making body in this country. And with the stakes so high for women's safety in this country, with 70 women dying every month at the hands of an intimate partner, we cannot let that happen. I yield the floor.